So I want to talk a little bit more about what happens when people get a sense of their own power. And in this case, it's another event in recent history that I know from some personal contact. And this was a man who was a very good hunter. He had three grown sons, 2 daughters that I know of, maybe a bigger family than that. And one winter, he just decided that his wife was no longer interesting enough sexually, so he would sleep with one of his daughters. Well, needless to say, the family was taken aback. He didn't care. He figured that he was powerful enough, spiritually as well as physically, to do what he wanted. Above the law, you might say. Because there is a law. It is an ethical law. And Gertie's son, who was the lawyer, used Cree narrative stories as case law when he was in law school. It is a law, okay? And so he did sleep with his daughter. And when they got back to the post, the oldest son went to him and he said, "If you do that again this coming winter, I will call the RCMP." Off they went. He did it again. When they came back in the summer, they called the RCMP. Came in, took him away. No word of him to this day. What happened to him, where he went, whether he was tried, jailed, sent somewhere else, don't know. Now, being lost, if you'll remember from the Big Beaver, being lost is not a good thing. Being away from all of your relatives. And to some extent to lose your humanity, I think, in the case of incest. I knew the daughter. She was married, a little late, but she was married. And her husband was teased. You only got half a wife. So he left his wife. Their son was adopted by another family, actually by a widow. And they didn't speak to each other, he and his father. And it was because of the shame that he felt. Now, the shame that she felt, I can't speak to because I don't know. I know that she was a nice old lady. I know that she made the braided caribou hide cords for pulling animals, what they call nimaban. And that she lived to a pretty good old age. But there's an example of somebody that abuses his power and whose sense of his own power is destructive. And so it was with Mescano. Mescano was John Blacknad's grandfather's father. Another connection there. Lots of connections. Anyway, that's an example. It is, I cannot tell you what the word criminal would mean in a Cree context. I just don't know. But it's something like that. And its long-term consequences were damaging. Not only for the man that was taken away, for the feelings of his oldest son, who called the cops on him. They couldn't do anything within Waskaganish because if you do something extreme like that, you're followed by responsibility for the rest of your life. Call in an outside authority, out of mind, out of sight, not a problem. I got used in a very small way that way in Nemaska a few years back. Uh, you call in an outsider who can say something that people inside know but don't want to say, kind of thing. So, like conjuring, it involves people with a sense of entitlement and power and a big risk. And so it also, in a way, this is going to veer off slightly on a tangent, in a way, it's like madness. And indeed, conjurers are thought to have bad hearts, at least some of them. And people aren't sure which ones. This was the case of a woman who became violently psychotic while her husband and children were with her in the bush. And the husband couldn't go hunting because he had to be there to protect his children. And so finally, he tied her to a log inside the tent, kept the fire going, went hunting, came back. She was still alive, still out of control, out of control. The out of control is what relates, I think, to conjuring, because she was not cursing him or threatening him. It wasn't thought that she was conjuring him. But when they were able to have enough food for several days, they left her in the tent for the fire to go out, and they went back to the post and reported it to the manager. The manager was a Scot, and he really wasn't up to going out there and finding the wreckage of a family. But there was a manager of the competition, Reverend Fair at the time, who was part Cree, and he could not, in conscience, leave it at that. And when he arrived there, she was nearly frozen, but she was still alive. And it is said that she looked at him and said, "I knew you would come." So he took her back to the community. Her psychosis apparently was gone. She went back to her family. They lived for many years. So power can come from many sources, some of them wanted, some of them not. But it seems not normal. Mental illness to us is one kind of not normal. Sorcery to them is not normal. Conjuring for the benefit of people, where are the animals? What's it going to be like next winter? It's more like the Farmer's Almanac. It's not dangerous. It may be wrong, but surprisingly, it may be right. This is what Hallowell found when he was studying conjuring tents, and I'll have to tell you just a bit of that. He was urged by somebody there to ask about the status of his mother, Hallowell's mother, who lived in Philadelphia in a brownstone house and who had been ill when he left. And so he asked. The Mustabe was gone for quite a while. When he got back, he said, "Well, I don't know if I found the right person," he says, "but if I did, she doesn't live in a Michwap. She lives in a stone house. And if that's her, she is no worse," which was exactly true, he found when he went back. He put that in his book, and I credit him for that. It doesn't make him a believer, but it makes him very impressed. That's the way I am on that subject, too. I'm not going to take a stand this way or that way, and there are lots of out-of-the-ordinary things in different cultures that bear understanding before you do judgment on them. And, yeah. Okay, well, what else about Cree narrative?
maybe you could tell us about the Together We Survive.
Sure. Okay. Well, I had this done well after I retired. A friend of mine, John Long, decided to do a Festschrift for me, edit. I don't know if he would have done it if he had any idea how difficult and protracted it would be, but he did a beautiful job, and it's very flattering in late life to get an appreciation like this, and from people that I admire a good deal, quite a lot. So the cover is by Tim Whiskey Chan, and I'll put it up here. And that's of an old-time man, and behind his face is what is inside his mind. The bush, meechwop, snowshoes, geese overhead, and so on. And for those who are on the inside, the contour of James Bay, east coast of James Bay, coming down behind him. You got to be an insider to recognize that, but it's there. And the black spruce tree that has mostly just a few tufts at the top has a bit of an explanation that goes with it too. When a person dies, they would mark the grave with Mishtakokan. It's a tree, spruce tree, Mishtakokan. It's something that is made. Kan suffix. And what they leave on is the new growth, the young life. They strip the rest of the branches off for a grave marker. There are not many branches at the bottom of this either. But it's like a tombstone, but a little more life to it. Quite a little more life to it. I've seen them. Gertie's older sister lost a baby one winter, and we got there at Easter time, and she wanted a photograph. And it had a wreath, plastic flower wreath on it. So it's perfectly fine. At any rate, the idea of getting at what is inside the mind of an old man is exactly what I have put my career into. So this portrait of the old man appeals to me a great deal. Tim Whiskey Chan managed to capture in watercolors what I have tried to capture in about 100 articles. And very gracefully, very nice man, generous man. And the book was financed in an unusual way. University presses have to be able to get a subsidy of some kind. And depending on the kind of book, they can get Social Science Research Council subsidy. But that has to be solely authored and not published elsewhere. This had many authors, and so we had to rummage up some money. McMaster University contributed $1,000, which we were glad for. The Crees contributed the rest, $12,000. Well, that's pretty generous on their part. And so it makes me feel like I've done okay by my colleagues who wrote complimentary papers, others whose didn't get included, and also appreciated by the Crees. And that's a deep satisfaction. And this has got some interview stuff with me, but it's mostly by other people. And, some good stuff in it. John unfortunately survived cancer only long enough to receive the hot off the press copy of it. because he was taken by cancer. And that's a real shame. I'm sorry. His diagnosis came too late. But there's not much you can do about cancer. That's just the way it is. I was given more life by chemotherapy that came in time and was successful, so I have more years, unless something else gets me. And to look at having chemotherapy as the gift of more years is a little unusual and optimistic. And so anyway, it's a Festschrift, it's a late-in-life event, and one of the chapters in there is from Stan, my colleague in the Cree history book, and others from former students or colleagues or whatever. Very nice. Anyway, talk a little bit about really mostly the Cree narrative book. What is its place in the Cree's own tradition? Here are these stories in English in a book. And a book gives things a fixed form. It doesn't mature with age, as oral tradition does. So it's a radical departure. But I don't feel that I've made a mistake in doing that, because what we're getting now is Crees who are writing poetry, prose, some pretty nice stuff, and the beginning in that of a Cree literary tradition. And this is a kind of a kingpin. It is also online in John Blacknud's voice. So if they want to hear an old-timey Cree, make it hard for them to understand their own language, because the old-timey stuff is a bit different. Some of the words are unfamiliar. People can do that. And if they're very seriously interested in Cree literature, that's the way to go. I'm very pleased that I had those tape recordings. I'm really sorry about 1965, but couldn't get a machine. And I'm sorry about any flaws in the other recordings, because it was basically a 3995 tape recorder that had a knob for variable speed, which wasn't a good idea. So I wasn't sure how I was doing there. Anyway, they're there. And it is a contribution to the beginnings of a Cree literature. And there are lots of other published stories, Cree and elsewhere, of course. But there's a whole, literary is the wrong word, I guess, because it's unwritten until somebody else comes along and records it and writes it. But an oral tradition that has now become a written tradition. And the oral tradition is extremely rich, extremely original, and very valuable. There are lessons for everybody in what those stories have to say. End of sermon, I think, on that one. Contribution to the field of Cree narrative, I've already mentioned that it gives an interpretation of texts, not just a listing of texts. And that requires that I have developed some understanding in order to give an interpretation. And that took a good deal of time and thought. Pat yourself on the back, Dick. All right. When I was in Ottawa looking in the archives for something in about 2003, I was going through the RG10 files. Here was a very thick manila folder with a manuscript in it, and the label said anonymous. reflections of one of the descendants of one of the last traders of the Northwest Company. So I pulled it out. Wasn't what I went there for. It was an autobiography of Henry Connolly, whose mother was Cree from Alberta, and whose father was a chief trader, first for the Northwest Company and later for the Hudson's Bay Company. And so I read it, and then I got a copy of it. And here's a guy who had a real feel for what he was doing, and interested in emotional dynamics, among other things. His father wanted him to become a physician, but as he put it, he had no stomach for carving, which is what physicians could do in those days. Either you watch them die or you perform surgery. And so he went into the fur trade. And it's quite a lovely story. I'll just give you a tiny bit of the beginning of it. Henry was an assistant. Actually, he was at Waskaganish. And being literate, because his father had sent him to residential school in Montreal for some years, he kept the record book, the journal, at Waskaganish, and then he got sent to Alaclash and was given a communique to take to the manager at Winnipeg, Fort William? I don't know. And when he arrived with this communique, still a very young fellow, hadn't finished his first term, his first contract out yet, the manager was out of town, so he took it to the manager's house, and the door was answered by the maid, who was a Cree Métis woman from the area. And she is recorded as saying, "When I opened the door and looked at him, I thought, this is the man for me." Well, they were married for, I think, 60 years. He was turfed out for getting married, which was against the rules for a person on their first contract. But he wanted to get back in, and his father interceded with him, with Sir George Simpson, and they sent him to the interior of Labrador, which is sort of like being sent to Siberia. And he went as an assistant to a man of few scruples and less morals, whom he served under for a while until that fellow was transferred out, and eventually drank his way down to the bottom of the hierarchy down on the St. Lawrence. But Henry and his wife snowshoed wherever they went, which included very, very long trips. And she was behind him on her snowshoes. And he was a nice man. He was a very likable man. And he was briefly but poignantly open about his boss there. I remember reading in the journal, he'd handwritten in "a viper." Make of that what you will. And at the same time, held the man responsible for refusing to give more ammunition to the Naskapi when they came in the middle of the winter in poor condition. And that was a bad winter, and many of them died, and he thought that this was the responsibility of the manager. Anyway, I thought it deserved publication. I wrote a paper or two on it. I have found somebody who, in her spare time, and she hadn't got much of it, is completing an academic autobiography, all the proper references and things checked. And I guess that may appear while I'm still alive, I hope. But Henry was a very likable man, and I could relate to what he was saying. And so that was a nice discovery. I've written a couple of papers on 20th century transformations in Cree country, which included moving into the job economy. Co-wrote that with a former president at Mac, who was a part of research team we had for a while. And there are plenty of them, 20th century transformations. They're major, major, major. And I'd have to say the Crees have proven able to deal with a whole new genre of hardships with quite a lot of success. And I gave one on comparing Cree traditions and Quaker values. I'm not a proselytizer. Quakers are not supposed to be proselytizers, so we do it very indirectly in a genteel way, but there were a lot of similarities. The bush ethics and Quaker ethics, the dislike of rank, the idea of fairness and respect in relationships and so on. And I didn't get any bad reactions or rotten vegetables when I gave it at the Algonquin Conference. And I gave one called Packing It In back in 1999. I got quite a turnout for that at the Algonquin Conference. Even the linguists came because they thought I was giving up. And I explained that packing it in meant, what are you going to do with all your field notes when you're through with them? Because I had spent months on John Honigman's field notes from Attawapiskat, and I could sort of smell Attawapiskat in them sometimes, but John really should have been the one to write them up. And I realized the same thing happens to other people's notes. They go off to an archive, they're found by somebody that's archiving, like Henry Connolly's thing was, and then you do a more or less feeble job of what the guy that took them in the first place should have done. So this was how to archive a career, not saying bye now and walking off stage. I also got a little bit into what we call medical anthropology. When I was concerned about 20th century transformations, one of the big ones was the railroad line. One of the things it did was to make it possible for a disease to get on the train and get to northern Ontario, the Trans-Canada, while it was still the incubation period. So there was no isolation. So the Great Flu epidemic and tuberculosis, big time. And it turns out that factors going into tuberculosis include a sense of not being secure on the land and poverty and other things which are not biological, but primarily emotional. Back to emotional dynamics. And with that, I'll stop now.